Now I'd like to introduce Veronica, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the impacts of pesticides on bee health. Thank you, Veronica.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to present today. I'm Dr. Veronica Earyart. I just recently defended my PhD last month at my home institution at the University of Pittsburgh in the United States. I've been living for the past few months in Melbourne, and I've been very lucky to be a visiting scholar. My dissertation was about the ecological impacts of herbicide pollution on plants and their interactions with other species, but a good chunk of that research had implications for pollinators and bees. So excited to share some of those results with you today, and just also some of the general things that I've learned about impacts of pesticides on bee health. To begin, I thought I'd start with a topic that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is the growing concern that we might be entering a quote pollinator crisis. And that's because reports from around the world have been indicating that pollinator populations have been declining in recent decades. And this has been seen both in managed pollinator populations, such as from honeybees, but also in wild pollinators like native bees and other important pollinators such as hoverflies. And of course, this is of significance to us because in addition to the delicious honey that we get from pollinators like honeybees, we also get pollination services. So almost all of the world's flowering plants are pollinated by animals, and many of these are the agricultural crops that we depend on for food. You might have noticed that in the previous slide, the data that I'd shown has been from the US and the UK. Recently, it's been asked whether the pollination crisis is also relevant to Australia and its neighboring countries, or has it theoretically dodged the bullet. Some Australian researchers did this literature review, and they found that in looking at articles that had referred to the pollination crisis or the pollinator crisis, the vast majority of those articles did come from Europe or North America, and only one came from New Zealand and 0 from Australia. However, when they looked at the kind of risk factors that are known to affect pollinator decline, such as climate change, pests and disease, invasive species, habitat degradation, and pesticide use, they found that many of the risk factors are present in Australia and its neighbors. And so they kind of point to the fact that there should be more research on monitoring pollinator populations to see if they're also being affected by these stressors. And in particular, they do highlight pesticide use as something that's used at similar rates in Australia as compared to these other countries, and the types of chemicals used are also pretty similar. So potentially more research into this issue is needed. And so when thinking about how pesticides could come to affect bees, we know that they're applied at increasingly high rates to meet global food production demands. If they're present in the environment, there are many ways that bees could come in contact with them. And so the most obvious way is that you think of a pesticide spray, bees could come in contact with them directly by being exposed in the environment. So foraging bees could get the chemical like on their wings and then bring it back to the hive to expose other members. But also many bees are ground nesting. So when pesticides are applied directly to soil, they could come in contact with those bees in that way. But another important way that pesticides could come in contact with bees is through the plants that they forage on. And in particular, a lot of insecticides are systemic pesticides. So that means that the plant takes up the chemical and it migrates to different parts of the plant. And so residues can be found in the pollen and nectar that bees forage on. And then lastly, a way that bees can be indirectly exposed to pesticides is through off-target exposure. So when pesticides applied to a crop, it can be taken away by different vectors like wind or precipitation. And so that way bees can be getting contact with it either through their bodies or by foraging on plants that are affected by that off-target movement. And so once this pesticide exposure happens, there's a lot of data suggesting that certain pesticides can be detrimental to bee health. And in particular, neonicotinoids have received a lot of attention for being potentially threatening to bees. So neonicotinoids are a type of systemic pesticide, so they can be present in the nectar and pollen of plants that bees forage on. And the way it acts to kill target insects is it acts as a neurotoxin. So if bees are exposed to high levels of neonicotinoids, it could be lethal to them. But oftentimes the concentrations that bees are exposed to in natural settings or near agriculture are low enough to just have sublethal effects. But oftentimes these can still be pretty severe and include impairments to how they can fly and forage, and also potentially compromise their immune systems and delay their reproduction or development. And I think some of the most impressive studies that have looked into the effects of sublethal neonicotinoid exposures on bees is studies on how it affects their navigation. So in this study, the researchers had honeybees trained to find a feeder and then return to their hive, but then they moved them so that they were released into a new area, and they used these radars to track their navigation back to the hive. And so what they found was that the control bees pretty easily were able to find their way back to the hive using kind of natural landmarks that they had remembered from before when they were foraging. However, the bees that had been treated with a sublethal dose of a common neonicotinoid got very lost, and some couldn't make it back to the hive. So this kind of body of work has been showing that even lower levels of some neonicotinoids can be detrimental to kind of the higher functioning of bees. And so while I've been presenting on mainly insecticides and they've received a lot of attention, herbicides, so pesticides targeted towards plants, can also pose a threat to bee health in kind of less obvious ways. And this is important because herbicides comprise the most commonly used type of pesticide over the world. And the way that they could impact bees and other pollinators is that if these herbicides contaminate the plant communities near agricultural sites, they could affect the flower production of plant species and thus the resources that are available for bees and other pollinators to forage on. And so that's really what my PhD research has addressed. I'm looking at how herbicide contamination can affect plant and pollinator interactions. And in particular, I've been looking at this herbicide called dicamba, which has been rapidly rising in use to replace a pesticide that you might be familiar with, Roundup. And another reason why dicamba has been a focus of our research is that it has been associated with a lot of off-target movement. So in this video, you can see that when the researchers tainted dicamba with a red dye, it can be easily taken up by the wind, and then it can expose non-target areas to a low concentration. And so I've been doing some greenhouse and field experiments to test how exposure to dicamba at a drift level would affect wild plant communities and the floral resources they produce, and thus the pollinators that would visit them. And in particular, I did 2 experiments to address this problem that I'll share with you today. In one experiment, I planted 25 different plant species that are commonly found near agriculture in real drift events. And then half of the other plants were treated with a water solution as a control. And then I collected data on the number of flowers that were produced over a growing season, so over like 4 months, and constructed these flowering networks that are kind of like social networks with people. In a sense, they show you when species are overlapping and flowering, and so they can give you a sense of what types of flowers are present in a community. And then in a second experiment, my research team and I looked at a subset of plant species from this greenhouse experiment and then did replicate plant communities in these field plots. And we applied half of the plots with the dicamba drift treatment and the other half with the control. And then we did pollinator surveys to see what insects visited them and also categorize them by their general functional group. And so for the first results of that greenhouse community, looking at how dicamba drift exposure affected flowering, we found a significant effect of dicamba on these flowering networks. And so if you look at the control network on the left, for example, each of these circles is a different plant species. And so they're labeled by a species code. And every time there's a line between species, that indicates that the species had been flowering at the same time. And the thickness of the line shows how many flowers were being shared between those species. So if you look at then the dicamba drift network on the right, we see that there's far fewer connections here. And so that represents that at any given time in the experiment, there were less flowers present among these plants, and also less species were overlapping. And so this could reflect like a reduction in the quantity and diversity of floral resources available. And then looking at the results from the field, we also saw that those plant communities that were exposed to dicamba drift received far less insect visitors. So it was about a 70% decrease overall in the number of insects found in those plots. And then looking at the types of pollinators that visited the plots, we saw that this kind of decrease was universal across the groups. And I won't go through all of them individually, but these three were the bee groups that we looked at. So we characterized honeybees, bumblebees, and all the remaining types of bees in another group, and saw that there were significant reductions where the bees tended to avoid those plots that were treated with the herbicide. And so what this could mean for bees and other pollinators in the wild is that even low amounts of herbicide contamination could alter the quantity or the quality of the pollen and nectar resources that bees would have accessible to them. And so they may have to expend more energy trying to forage for food in landscapes that are affected by herbicide pollution. And I thought I would just end with some general recommendations for beekeepers to better protect their bees from these potential detrimental effects of pesticides. One of the first ways that this can be done is by, when you're considering a location for an apiary, to consider the potential pesticide exposure risk. And so I emphasize not just the direct exposure that the bees could come in contact with, but also looking at the exposure of the plant communities that they might use as forage. And then if you know that pesticides are being applied near beehives or nests, it's important to ensure that label recommendations are being followed to minimize off-target exposures. For example, you can avoid spraying when you know that bees are going to be active, or avoid applying when wind speeds are high that could promote drift. And then lastly, it's very important to report any suspected pesticide-related bee incidents to state and territory governments. So that would be like the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, because the more data we have, the better we are at being able to monitor how significant this issue is. So with that, I'd just like to thank my research team, my lab back home at the University of Pittsburgh, for all of their support and helping me carry out my projects, and my funding sources and collaborators, and especially Scarlett Howard and the ICEB lab at Monash for being so welcoming to me during my time in Melbourne. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Just a comment, which Veronica may or may not be aware of because she's from the US. The beekeeping practices in Australia and the US are quite different. In particular, the use of pesticide is that in Australia, the majority of beekeepers actually make most of their money from producing honey, and they do that by generally moving their hives around flowering eucalypt forests. So they spend their time looking at when eucalypts are flowering, which is not on a yearly basis. They have irregular flowering patterns, and they're moving their hives to generally state forests or other areas where they are flowering at the time. Well, they tend to be much less exposed to pesticides compared to how they would be exposed in Europe or in the US. Generally, they follow more pollination events and are less reliant on honey production as a source of income. And I thought it would be useful to make that comment because you come from a different place in terms of beekeeping practice. practices.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's very useful to know. And yeah, I'm still kind of learning the different practices in different countries.
I think it's particularly important because we don't seem to have a lot of issues with nicotinoids in Australia, where obviously they have in the US, and in Europe they have, at least for some time, did an embargo on the
Yeah.
use of them.
Mhm.
We are not under embargo, so we use them, but they don't seem to be a problem. And I think the main reason is that the bees, at least the managed honeybees, are generally more separated from our agricultural places compared to how they would be in other places such as the US.
Are there implications for the bees in the city if people are using these pesticides?
Yes, I agree. I think it could be a broader issue. I think we need more data on it. It seems like generally for a lot of pesticide studies, the focus is on the direct toxicity to the animals. And so kind of these more indirect pathways for how they could be affected receive less attention. But I do agree that it, yeah, very much could be affecting bees in the city. And I know in the US, Roundup and dicamba can be purchased local hardware stores and garden, and potentially they could be having these unknown effects in these contexts too.
Thank you, Veronica.